Hi, today we're talking about preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, which is to say, we're talking about topics to preach about. The saying about preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other comes from Karl Barth, who is pretty well known as most likely the 20th century's greatest theologian. He was Swiss and quite a writer. He did a lot of preaching, wrote a lot of books, and was a major influence across Christendom over the 20th and even now in the 20th century. Notice we're still talking about him. So anyway, so it's about making a connection between culture and making a connection with the world of the church. You know, one of the things I notice about a lot of preaching is that pastors very often uh, tend to preach on questions that nobody's really asking. You know, probably no one in your church is really talking about the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And yet, that kind of conversation, 500, 501, 525, whatever it is, at any given time, no one's talking about the Reformation except church people. And yes, it's a good history lesson, but is it really relevant to what's going on in your congregation? And yes, a nod to history is a good thing, but again, no one's asking those questions. No one's asking questions really about the Trinity outside the church. No one's asking about the atonement. No one's asking about the end of the world even much anymore. People are asking a whole lot of different questions, and yet repeatedly we see pastors preaching on topics that are not in the mainstream conversation. And if things aren't in the mainstream population, if people aren't worried about it, why in the world would we think our sermons are going to impact them? I think most of you have at one time or another taken my evangelism class or taken an evangelism class. And hopefully, in no matter which class you've taken, that someone gave you an assignment. And if you haven't done this assignment, then I strongly recommend it. The class assignment was to go ask questions to some unchurched young adults and asked what are their top concerns, what are the top questions that they're wrestling with in their lives. When I've done this in class, virtually everyone is surprised that these people aren't asking spiritual questions. They're not asking about life after death questions. They're not asking about heaven or hell or demons or angels. They're asking about how to have a better job, how to have a viable family, how to get good insurance, sometimes political stuff, sometimes world stuff, but almost never theological stuff, not spiritual stuff. Except everything that they're asking is spiritual. That's just a reality, is that Jesus and the boys, the early church, they dealt with real world stuff. And everything that you think about, every action you take, every bite you put in your mouth, every decision you make, every one of those has spiritual implications. And we often, as pastors and as preachers, we miss that. You know, if Jesus is the primary model for preaching and preaching topics, and then secondary would be the preaching that you see in Acts, and those are the only two places where we really see preaching in the New Testament. Paul doesn't preach, he's writing letters. So Jesus is primary teacher, and the Acts is how the church chose to interpret that. Then you'll notice that Jesus and the boys just never, hardly ever talked about a lot of things that preachers preach about today. They didn't talk about systemic issues. They didn't talk about the world and global issues in general. I'll touch on that in a moment. They didn't talk about the sins of the community. They dealt with you. They dealt with me. They dealt with spiritual issues on an individual basis, even when they spoke to large crowds. You know, the key to really excellent, effective, life-impacting preaching is relevance. Sermons, if they're going to have an impact, they have to touch someone, the hearer, at some point of need. Something inside them that they're wrestling with, or a question they have, a concern they have, a pondering they have. If your sermon is going to be effective, it needs to address those things. However, you may remember a guy named Steve Jobs. He was the Apple guy. And one of the things that he was famous for was producing products that no one knew they wanted. But then, of course, everybody wanted. And Steve Jobs says, one of his quotes was, "They'll know what they want when I show them what they want." And that's, if you will, sort of a paradox, because it's also accurate. We need to touch people at their point of needs, but sometimes you're going to have to make connections in their real life to something that the scripture touches on. But you're going to have to make that connection. You're going to have to make it relevant for them. And that's one of the pieces of great preaching. So let me just wrap this up by saying that there's some questions you need to ask before you start picking a topic that you want to preach on or feel like you need to preach on. First, I love the lectionary. I love what it does in terms of dividing up the scripture and, quote, keeping us honest. But it's very hard to do a sermon series using a lectionary. It can be done, but it's not necessarily the best way. And the goal of preaching isn't to educate, it's to inspire, motivate, move, and get people to do something. So, number one is when you look for a topic or series that you're going to be touching on, number one is, what are the needs of the congregation? You should know this left, right, and center. You should know what your congregation needs to know, what they need. Now, please know I'm talking about what they need, not what they need to feel good. Your job as a preacher isn't to help them feel good. Your job is to help them do good. And there's a huge difference. The point of preaching is helping them to move forward into doing good deeds, doing things that are life-changing in other people's lives. So number one, what is the need of the congregation? But you have to balance that with those who aren't here yet. Because if you only ever preach to your congregation, if a visitor comes, they're not coming back because it's not their need. So number two is preaching about the concerns of the community. What is your community concerned with? What are their needs? What are their fears? What are their hot topics this week? What is it that they're wrestling with? And remember that no matter how trivial or how secular or worldly you might think that their responses, needs, fears, hot topics, concerns are, is that they're all spiritual needs. Every single one of them, no matter what. Every need is a spiritual need. Third is, there are times when we need to give a nod to the larger national, global, or even the systemic issues in our culture. And, to do so isn't a bad thing. But you have to remember that your church is a local church. And in my humble opinion, or maybe not so humble, most sermons need to hit the road that your members are traveling, not the road that the rest of the world is traveling necessarily. Jesus did talk about national news in his day. A couple times he referenced some national tragedies or events that had happened. But he always used those news pieces as an example for local and personal use. He tried to connect them, or always connected them, to the individual. He never talked about how the church or how you are to affect or impact national crises or national concerns or worries or global anything. He connected it to local. If you can't make a local connection, then it may not be a worthy topic. Finally, you got to keep up with the culture. If you're going to have one hand on the Bible and the other hand on the newspaper, which of course almost no one does newspapers anymore, but the point is you got to be informed in Scripture and in your congregation, and you got to have one foot, if you will, in the culture, your local people who are not Christians yet. So you need to read books. We've talked about that in this class already, but you need to read. And you need to read books of within your field. Obviously, you need to read church growth. I suppose you need to read some theology. You definitely need to be reading the scripture and so on. But you also need to read books that are outside your field. I read a lot of business books. And the reason I read business books is because I'm in the I'm in the career, if you will. I'm in the field of church growth. My job is to help people become disciples of Jesus Christ. That's church growth, evangelism, and discipleship. So I read business because it's about growth, growth of businesses, etc. So read outside your field. But you also need to read some blogs, current blogs. I love Seth Godin. He's an incredible blogger. At this point in time, he's the nation's, maybe the world's most subscribed blogger. You need to read journals and magazines. I don't read the Wall Street Journal, but I read Harvard Business Review. I read journals such as Outreach Magazine. I of course subscribe to Net Results Magazine. Everyone should have that one. And you should also read for some fun. Just totally whatever for funsies, whatever it is you read. Then you also need to be watching the most popular television shows, or at least be conversant with them. I'm not advocating sitting down in front of the TV and watching. That's a waste of time. But or can be a waste of time. But you need to be up on what's going on, and at least being able to be conversant with the television shows that your folks are watching and what the community is watching. Because if you're not relevant with that, if you're not able to be conversant with that, then you're sort of up a creek without a paddle in terms of having conversation and being relevant. You also need to go to the movies that your people are going to. And by your people, I mean your culture. Now, yes, there's some movies that you probably ought not go see. I'm not let's go see 50 Shades of Grey because everyone's going to go see 50 Shades of Grey. There's some places you got to draw the line. But check out the ones that are, getting high sales and a lot of talk. Just so, again, you can be conversant. Because if you can't, again, be conversant, then you're not going to be perceived as being relevant. A well-informed and a well-rounded pastor who has one foot in culture and the other in church is never going to have any problems finding topics that need to be talked about from the pulpit. I'll see you next week.